Okay, this is a distributor that General Motors used for some time in the mid-80s. This has a helicoil type system. The coil is inside, which we'll show you in the cap. This was mechanically driven off of the camshaft. So this little gear right here would spin and twist the distributor. At the bottom of this gear, there's a little, looks like a flat blade screwdriver that turned the oil pump. So it allowed oil to be pumped through the system, and the camshaft turned this, that spun the different components inside. So we're going to remove the cap here. There's an electrical connector here that's attached to our pickup and our ignition module. And power also goes through the centerpiece. So 12 volts will go in here that's not on this connector, and this goes down inside to the inside of our distributor. So this connector powers up this ignition module. This is an ignition module. And we have a ignition condenser. And then this is kind of hard to see, but there's a little reluctor ring here, and it's measuring the position of the crankshaft. This piece is the rotor, and the rotor transfers the voltage from the center of the distributor cap out to the spark plugs through the center electrode here. So mechanically, as this is spinning, you can see the rotor is spinning as I'm spinning this, and it's delivering that spark from the center out. And voltage goes directly to this center electrode that touches to this rotor, and then delivered to these outside pieces. That is plugged onto a spark plug wire, and then that spark plug wire goes down to the spark plug. So this was all mechanically with some electronics involved. Inside, on top of the distributor here, we have a ignition coil, and this is taking 12 volts from these two pieces, 12 volts into this ignition coil, and making 20,000 up to 100,000 volts of electricity. And that's sending it to this piece right here. So if we replace this ignition coil, when it's energized, there's a little piece in here that transfers that power through that piece, and this is a rubber insulator, and then that goes directly to this piece. You can see I can actually probably just push that out, and that's where the volts will transfer from here to here. And then that goes to the distributor to spin voltage down the wires to the spark plugs. So this is a mechanical distributor used to control the ignition system. This particular distributor used points and condensers. So we have ignition points that are tapped here. So as I spin this, you'll see that little lever right here. It will move. So maybe your parents have talked about setting points and condensers, and that little cam right here pushes on that little point and completes the contacts for the ignition system. They used this for mechanical distributors for years and years until they started putting more electronics in place. This distributor is the same thing as this one. We've just removed the distributor cap, and you can see the ignition module. Now we can see the pickup with this reluctor ring, and they had some Hall effect and pickup type systems that used electronics to send signal, and these are magnetic. And that magnetic piece delivers the input to send the spark. This particular distributor is on a Honda, and the coil is inside. The rotor has been replaced, and then we have inputs here, and mechanically this is spun just like our teeth on our distributor. This one is spinning this shaft that's hooked to a rotor. And all of that voltage will transfer to a center electrode and then down this through the wire to the spark plug. So all mechanically controlled. This is a rotor that's been removed. See right here, this rotor, and as it spins, same thing, I want to visually inspect this electrode here and here to make sure there's no burnt contacts. And if there's burnt contacts on that or the cap, I need to replace the cap or I need to replace the rotor. This rotor that's removed from here, I inspect the contacts, make sure they're not burnt here and here. And we want to visually inspect the rotor. We want to visually inspect the cap. If there's any cracks in the cap, and like this one here that's brand new, that somehow got dropped, this won't transfer the electricity. So if there's any cracks along here on the side, we have to replace the distributor. And you may find one of these, which is an ignition coil, that is not on top of the distributor cap. So this is the helicoil system with distributor cap. This one is delivering power from the distributor cap here in the middle through here. So voltage comes out here into the center of the cap. So if you have one of these wires in the center of the cap, voltage is going to come out of this coil to the distributor cap. And for us to test these components, what I've got here is a multimeter, and we're going to put it to ohms, and we're going to do some resistance tests. This is very simple and basic for our ignition coil here. And I can take a primary winding ignition coil value, and I simply touch these two posts here, and I see what the the ohms reading is on the multimeter. And then I'm going to do an ohm test through the center and then here to see the output coil. So that's a secondary coil, and this is a primary coil test. For spark plug wires, as they start to wear down, I can actually ohm test the wire by simply placing one electrode here, and then I can touch the other wire with the other wire with the multimeter, and it shows a resistance value. As a rule of thumb, we have about 4,000 ohms per foot of wire. So if this wire has more resistance or less resistance and it's not delivering proper spark, I would just recommend changing the wires. And whenever you're changing the wires, we don't want to mix these up because, again, the distributor sends the spark to the different wires at the different cylinders as it's transferring that. So remove them one at a time when you change them out. And this is basically the distributor ignition system here, where we covered the primary ignition system, the ignition coil, changes it to secondary ignition going to the distributor and cap, and that secondary ignition system goes down a wire to ignite the spark plug. And so it's good to become familiar with these, so then that way you know how to troubleshoot and fix your ignition system on the distributor type ignitions. Okay? Okay, the distributorless ignition system is all electronically controlled. There's no mechanical parts here. So what we've got are a couple of inputs, and these are crankshaft and camshaft position sensors. These give input to the car's PCM, which is the computer of the car, and through these connectors here, through wires going to this, it's going to say what position the crankshaft's in, what position the camshaft's in. These input sensors are magnetic. So I have a screwdriver. You can see that this is magnetic. It's an inductive coil, pickup coil that sends input to this computer. The computer then will send input to our secondary system, which is these ignition systems that we have here. So this is a distributorless ignition system. This particular system was used by General Motors. These are ignition coils, and they plug directly onto this ignition module. This is an ignition module. This ignition module, which we showed you in the distributor, is different. It's a big piece, and it has wires that go in that communicate with our computer. So these two are talking to each other. And we send spark through these ignition coils right here that are all lined up. And what's nice about these is General Motors made these so you can replace one of these coils. And you can see this coil 1 and 4 send spark at the same time. So I'm sending spark on the power stroke and the exhaust stroke. I'm sending spark on the power stroke, exhaust stroke, power stroke, exhaust stroke. And so power stroke and exhaust stroke on 4 may be the exhaust on 1. So this is controlling 2 cylinders at one time, unlike the distributor that's sending spark to all the different cylinders. And simply these just plug onto the spark plug wire, and then we have a spark plug attached to the end of the spark plug wire. So this is a distributorless ignition system used by General Motors. We have a couple other styles here. This one is Ford, which Ford used for a 6-cylinder. Notice it's 1 unit. So you can't change out the individual coils. This is 1 unit, you replace the whole unit. Dodge and Subaru use this one for a 4-cylinder. You can see this controls 1 and 4. So the coil is sending voltage through 1 and 4, both during the power and exhaust stroke, and 2 and 3 through the power and exhaust stroke. And this is given input through this connector through a wire going to the powertrain control module. And then the very last one is this one, which is a 4-cylinder Ford, which is a complete unit. And it's sending spark to 2 cylinders here, 2 cylinders here, because you can see the coils on the back here and here. So there's a coil here, a coil here. So 12 volts goes in, 20 to 100,000 volts, depending on the ignition system, goes out to our spark plug. Same things apply on this system or this system. So if you have these type of ignition systems, know how to troubleshoot it by, is there input from the ignition crankshaft and camshaft sensors? Is it getting to the computer, which is the PCM or the ECM? From there, is it getting to the ignition module underneath this piece? And then is it delivering spark out through the coil to the spark plug wire and spark plug? So this is 100% electronic. So we may need to have a scan tool. We may need to have some other things to diagnose and troubleshoot this type of ignition system. Okay. So with this type of ignition system, we have coil on plug. Similar to our distributorless ignition system components, we have crank and camshaft sensors that are direct inputs to our electronic control module, powertrain control module. And through the wiring of the connectors going back to ignition coils. We have 4 ignition coils here. The input from power, ground, and signal are all in these connectors and goes to one cylinder. So this will fire one cylinder only. So we've got 4 coils, 4 cylinders. Unlike our distributorless ignition that controlled 2, we have 1. Some manufacturers will have a coil on plug with a wonderful spark plug wire going to another cylinder. Very similar to the distributorless ignition system, it's going to fire this and this through the wire to another spark plug. So this is still called coil on plug ignition, but we have a wire with plug that sends a spark. Now, some of these ignition coil boots will wear out over time. Okay, so you can kind of see I'm twisting it, rotating it. I may need to replace these boots. As I'm removing the coil, these boots may pop off and become hard plastic pieces, intermediate pieces. Okay, and we could have a good coil, but then maybe this is cracked or broken, or maybe the rubber has been ruined because oil gets on rubber, it deteriorates. So they sell these boots for you to replace, and if it's like this style, then we just have the boot at the bottom. So visually inspect when you're doing your tests on these type of systems where maybe the boot is torn, where that spark doesn't go down the plug, it will shoot out the side of the boot. So it's important that you inspect these when you start changing these ignition coils out. All right.